This lecture will focus on the continued anger that was coming up from this fight between the pro-slavery South and the anti-slavery North in America. So politics started to change at this point. The Whig Party split up. It split into the Northern Whigs and the Southern Whigs, and the Northern Whigs said, "We Whigs of the North are unalterably determined never to even the slightest political correspondence or connection with the Southern Whigs." So basically saying, we're done with them. We're over it, because they were angry about the Kansas-Nebraska Act on both sides of it, right? Both sides were angry about it, and many people started to create this new party. Especially the Northerners were angry about it because it got rid of the thing that was stopping slavery from advancing. And so they created the Republican Party. They came together with the members of the Free Soil Party, some anti-slavery Democrats, and a lot of these former Whigs, and they created this brand new party named the Republican Party in 1854. And the Northern voters started to agree with them, and the party got a lot of votes in 1854. The Republican Party wasn't all about anti-slavery, but they definitely wanted slavery to stop expanding. They wanted it to be kept out of the new territories, and that was a big thing. Another party that kind of cropped up at this time and became really popular and won a lot of different small elections, like the Republican Party, was the American Party. And remember, the American Party was expanding in the North, and these are people, nativists, that were opposed to immigration and hated a lot of different people, especially Catholics. So anybody coming in that was a Catholic, they didn't like that. They wanted the immigration to stop coming in. But again, the American Party even was split based on these sectional lines of the North and the South, and slavery and non-slavery, and so eventually their party broke apart too, and the Northern American Party started to fold into that Republican Party. So the election of 1856 came up, and the competitors, the candidates were, first off, John C. Fremont. He was the first Republican candidate for president. He was a famous explorer, a general from out in California, right, where he had done his fighting and shown his worth. And he didn't really have much political experience at all, but nobody had any reason to hate him either, so that's kind of why he was chosen as the Republican candidate. He did speak in favor of Kansas becoming a free state. They wanted to be free, and so he thought that was better. Plus, as a Republican, he did not want slavery to expand out into the territories. So this obviously it made most people in the South really not ever going to vote for him, and so he really had no chance out there. James Buchanan was the Democrat. He was a Democratic candidate. He'd been in Congress for 20 years, had lots of experience, and he really thought that the best way to preserve the Union, to keep everybody together, to stop secession talks or anything like that, was just to give in a little bit to the South and make a compromise that helped out the South. So obviously he was very popular in the South, and in those kind of middle border states he was pretty popular too, because they didn't want a war or secession or some craziness to happen, right? The third party was the American Party. Their candidate was Millard Fillmore. They were really trying to grab some of those former Whigs and get them into the party, but the Whig Party had mostly fallen apart, and really the American Party didn't have much of a chance, but they did mess up the Republican Party's chance pretty much. Okay, so there were really two separate campaigns. Up in the North, it was Buchanan, the Democrat, versus Fremont, the Republican, and in the South, it was Buchanan versus Fillmore, because the Fremont never had a chance down there. And so these two separate campaigns kind of fleshed themselves out. And Buchanan, campaigning as the only man, he said he was the only man who could save the Union and had a plan for it. The other two were trying to break it apart, and he actually won. And he said, if you put Fremont in charge, the South will secede. If we put a Republican in charge, the South will break off, because they're going to feel like it's an attack on their institution of slavery and their culture in general. So to try and figure out this fight, James Buchanan suggested that maybe instead of Congress deciding, it should be the turn to take a shot at deciding slavery in these territories. And so he thought really the Supreme Court should make that final decision on slavery based on the Constitution and what was in there. And so a case was elevated quickly, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was a slave. He's this man up here. Okay, and he was his owner was Dr. Sanford. Okay, and his owner had taken him as a military doctor into a number of different free states, and then had returned back to Missouri, back into the slave state that he lived in. And so Dred Scott had been a slave and acted as a slave as he was living in these free states. And Scott sued, saying that as soon as he had spent any time in the free territory, as soon as he stepped into these free states, it meant that he was free and should be free. And so this decision went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard it, and Chief Justice Roger B. Taney gave the majority decision, and the majority decision was kind of shocking. Okay, the decision was that African Americans are not citizens, so they cannot sue in courts, so this whole entire thing should be thrown out. But not only that, he went above and beyond and said something completely that had nothing to do with the case at all. He said that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional and that the government cannot deprive the people of their property no matter what, and the slaves were their property. And so that basically made slavery legal everywhere. It took down all of these anti-slave laws and restrictions. Okay, the Northerners were very angry, and they said it's not valid because the Missouri Compromise had nothing to do with the case, like I said. And the Southerners celebrated. They saw this as a major victory. They thought, oh, we've won this argument about slavery. The Supreme Court has decided on our side. Okay, and so slavery could continue to live on. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint number 1. Why do you think that the Dred Scott ruling is seen as such a dark moment in the history of the Supreme Court? All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is what's continuing to happen in Kansas. Last time we left it was bleeding Kansas. There were big time problems. They wanted to be free, but there were all these people who were setting up their own governments. Okay, all that kind of stuff was happening. All right. The Republicans, they needed a strong candidate that they felt could beat Stephen Douglas in his home state, because it was very important to beat Stephen Douglas. And so they started to look for this candidate. But at the same time, Stephen Douglas was losing popularity in the South. Okay, and a lot of it had to do with how he handled the situation in Kansas. In Kansas, what Buchanan thought, James Buchanan just thought, if we can just get Kansas, push it through, make it become a state, then the argument could end and we won't have all of this anger in Congress and in the country and everything like that. And so the pro-slavery legislature set an election for delegates to write the Constitution. So they did the election, they picked their delegates, but this was the pro-slavery group, and so all of the people that were in this group were pro-slavery, and the anti-slavery people, they boycotted it. They said, we won't come to this. This is not a real government. This is fake. So they didn't do it. So of course, the Constitution that they created totally legalized slavery. Okay, and after that, 2 referendums, and a referendum is a direct vote by the people on the Constitution, happened. One by the anti-slave people, one by the pro-slave people. The anti-slave people rejected the Constitution. Okay, they didn't want it because it legalized slavery. The pro-slave people accepted this Constitution because, of course, they had created it. They wanted it to go through. And so Buchanan, having seen the Constitution, wanting it over with, accepted the Constitution, but the House of Representatives, when it was voted on, blocked it. They said they would not allow it to go through. And even the Representative Stephen Douglas rejected it. And that made a lot of the people in the South very angry at Stephen Douglas, because they thought that he was on their side. He wanted this to push through. He wanted Kansas to come through. And he had made the whole Kansas-Nebraska Act with the idea that Kansas was going to be a slave state. But they wanted to be free, and so Stephen Douglas said they should if they want to be. Okay, and so another instead of the Constitution going through, another constitutional referendum had to be brought up. And, Buchanan thought, well, with this new referendum, it'll work out because Kansas, if they don't choose a constitution, like if they don't okay this one, it's going to take a lot longer for them to become a state. And so they had another vote, and it led to the Constitution being rejected. This was an obvious vote showing that they, no matter what, Kansas wanted to become a free state and they were willing to wait if they had to. And so Kansas would become a free state, but it would take them 4 more additional years to become a state than it would have if they had entered as a slave state. All right, and so now we're going to talk about this argument and rivalry between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, because Abraham Lincoln was the man that those Republicans chose to run for Illinois Senate against Stephen Douglas and try and take Stephen Douglas out in his own state, which is what they really needed to be able to do. And in his inaugural speech, in his first speech, as he's coming up, he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He said that he thought that if the government continues to be half slave and half free, it will fall and it will fail. Okay, but he said, I don't think the government's going to fail. I just think it's going to become all one thing or all the other. So basically saying it's going to become all slave, the whole country will become slave legal, will legalize slavery, or the whole country will become free. And obviously he wanted it to be free. Now, Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He thought it was unreasonable that it should immediately be gotten rid of, but he morally opposed slavery. He did not want it to spread. He didn't like it, thought it was disgusting, and he didn't want it to spread. He just thought it would die off on its own. And so what he did is Douglas had all the fame, Douglas had all the power, and so Abraham Lincoln proposed a series of debates with Douglas to show that he could stand with him and hang with him as well. And so the Lincoln-Douglas debates did happen. Douglas was in favor of popular sovereignty. He thought that the new territories should get to decide if they wanted to have slavery or not. And so Lincoln used some interesting maneuvering, and he asked a question that trapped Douglas. And basically it asked him, so are you rejecting the Dred Scott decision by getting popular sovereignty, or are you abandoning the idea of popular sovereignty? Because Dred Scott decision says nobody can take away slavery. It doesn't matter if you vote. And popular sovereignty says you can vote to have slavery or not. And so the Freeport Doctrine was created by Stephen Douglas. Douglas said in the Freeport Doctrine that he accepts the Dred Scott decision, so it says, yes, that's legal, but the people can keep slavery out by refusing to create the laws to support slavery, basically. And this made the people in the South very angry because they had just won this victory of it's legal everywhere, and now Douglas was taking that away according to his opinion. So now he became very unpopular in the South. And Lincoln also just kind of pushed out some other of his ideas and the Republican ideas, and he said it's important to not let slavery spread because we don't want to let something that is wrong get bigger. We know it's wrong and we can't let it continue to spread. It needs to slowly die out. Douglas did win this election, but Lincoln was introduced to the country. He became much more famous, and the Republican Party's stance was made much more clear. People understood more what they stood for. And so this would help Lincoln in the future and the Republican Party. So some of the abolitionists were moved to act in a different way. John Brown was one of them. John Brown is this man right here. Okay, he was a strong abolitionist, and his plan was that action needed to be taken, and so he planned to seize the armory, the government weapons, in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And so he got a group of 18 people to come with him, and went to take out the arsenal. Okay, his plan was to grab those weapons and then start freeing slaves and arming them, and to begin an entire rebellion where it would just continue to get bigger and bigger, where the slaves would fight for themselves with the weapons that he provided. Okay, and when him and his 18 followers took the arsenal, the Marines did come in and captured John Brown, and kind of ended this entire idea, this entire raid, before it even really started. And Brown was sentenced to death. But Brown's execution, the way that he was killed, he was hung, and he said that at his execution, some of his last words were, he said that he was sure now that the only way for the crimes of the guilty land to be purged was through lots and lots of bloodshed. So basically saying, there's no way that we can fix this. People just will not take what is right, and that the only way to do this is for a civil war to happen. And so that's what he saw as the future. And even though he would die before he saw it because of his execution, he was correct in seeing that this would happen. And so the Northerners saw him as a martyr, fighting for a noble cause, willing to give up his own life for a noble cause. At the time of his death, church bells rang out across the North, to kind of give credit to him. And the Southerners saw him as evidence that the North was plotting to attack them and trying to come together and take their slavery away from them by force, and take their way of life and their culture and their money, I mean the thing that was making them money, and take everything from them. Take a moment to write out 3 questions that you have from the notes so far. If you have no questions, then create 3 test questions that you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.